Just to check whether the third judge is here. Yes, you are. Okay. Okay, so the prep time is over. Congrats to everyone for breaking to the quarterfinals. So my name is Janko. Judging with me are
Nick,
Pranav.
And now I will let you introduce yourselves and give me, and you don't even have to give me your speaking orders. So in opening government.
Oh, yeah, Teck's here there, please. Thank you.
Darion second, no preference, thank you.
In opening opposition.
Ahsan Mohammed as LO, here there.
Okay. The
second is Taha Iqbal, here there.
Okay. CG.
Amar speaking first, he there.
Okay. CEO. Oh, sorry, one more speaker. And another.
Here.
Full CEO.
Micaela speaking first, sheer day.
Hila speaking second, sheer day.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that this round is being streamed. Someone is saying that they can't hear. Okay.
Yeah, I think my partner's having audio problems, so I think he's gonna leave and rejoin.
Okay, we'll wait. We'll then wait for them. Can you hear now? Yes, cool. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister. And also, just before you begin, just two notes. Okay, you know how you want to ask your POI. Preferably ask for POI, say who they want to take it from, just so you don't waste your time in your speech. Obviously, you can do it in any way you find suitable. In case that I cannot hear you, I will just say something short, like louder or something like that, to let you know. And now we invite the Prime Minister.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm happy to take POIs via just pop a message into the chat. That's probably the best for me. Thank you. The glorification of genius looks like several key things. Number one, genius is often seen as innate. It is fundamentally something that a person has or doesn't have, and it's fundamentally different to what the ordinary humans, or plebs as they were, live their lives and how they see the world. Second, this uniqueness isn't demeaned, it's seen as superior. In some ways, it is seen as the peak of human existence, the very best that humanity has to offer, particularly when it comes to intellectual achievement. Three, very often we are in awe of contributions. We see them as overwhelmingly positive and sometimes inaccessible. We don't fully understand how it is they could have done that, which is part of what makes genius so terrifying and yet not aspirational, but sort of, I guess, nice for the human race. And last of all, genius is often the primary identity by which we classify and tag and think of someone. So we don't think of them as a teacher first, we think of them as a genius who also happens to use those gifts to teach, for instance, in a university or in that capacity. We are more likely to disregard divergent aspects of that identity. What is the counterfactual that we think is likely to happen? Well, to the extent that there are powerful forces in society that have to approve and explain success, success can be explained in three ways, or some combination of. One is talent, and that is what we are opposing broadly. The second and the third are luck and hard work. And we're not exactly sure what mix of the two will come about. And we're not going to commit to one or two of these just because it's not essential for our case. Darion might talk more about that. But what's crucial about both these things is that they're on net better and they avoid the harms that we're going to talk about right now. So, number one, this excuses a lot of abhorrent or tragic behavior or personalities or treatment as being perfectly acceptable, and that is bad, particularly in the environments where genius is most highly valued. The first way this happens is that immoral acts are often not criticized. Great example of this is Elon Musk, who we all think is a genius for pushing the boundaries of things like space technology or self-driving cars, but at the same time, we excuse blatantly abhorrent and irresponsible behavior, like randomly tweeting about people being pedophiles even after they've been asked to stop by regulators in the USA, or just arbitrarily tanking the value of a stock when any other business leader who was successful but not quite a genius would not have gotten the same free pass as he has. We excuse this stuff. Why? Because it's seen as A, eccentric, B, tied to what is crucial about them, and hence C, part of the price you pay for living in a world where Elon Musk is using his genius for social good. B, it's also sometimes harder to criticize the merit of their work per se when there's a certain cult of personality, e.g. around people like Einstein, where because we've defined them as genius, it's much more bias involved in your own mind as to whether you'd be willing to criticize that and commit to a position where they're wrong. I guess a good parallel to this is like a rep call in debating. But third of all, it also excuses bad things that's happened to them as part of what allowed them to tap on that genius. So the best example of this is a tortured artist style portrayal of people like Van Gogh, where we acknowledge that they were depressed, but a lot of the discourse around that depression isn't to point out how regrettable it was. We often justify it either explicitly sometimes or implicitly. We think of it as, again, part of the price you pay for the beautiful and brilliant art that's come about. What is the impact of this? It's twofold. Number one, it's harder to hold geniuses in the present day and age accountable for the terrible things they do, because to the extent that things like call-out culture does work, it's always less effective when it is shielded by genius across the board in all its areas. Second of all, it creates unhealthy cultures in a particular fields where genius is most associated with achievement. You look at things like art or academia, as opposed to, for instance, things like business, where the concept of hard work, elbow grease as a salesperson, making your way to the top is at least a little more prevalent. What happens is that people in these fields particularly get told to make excuses for their own tragedies, or their own suffering, or are often told to channel that into something more positive in order to tap on that genius. That's not a good thing because it puts them in more vulnerable positions where more likely they're likely to suffer from things like mental health. And there's more of that in just a second, but on the very first level, excuses are often made because you are told, or you do see yourself, or other people see you as a genius. Terrible thing for society, because it means that geniuses who, I think by ops logic, are going to be in some position of influence, don't get criticized and controlled in the way they use that influence, but also in fields where they're aspiring geniuses and people to do good things in society, their life is significantly worse off. Second, let's talk about how this translates into a far larger group of people who potentially have genius statuses as children, but for whom that classification is yet unclear. Lots of children, because they do some fancy things like learning to speak a few languages at a young age, which, to be fair, is extraordinary, it's easy to classify them as having genius type ability or being geniuses. And so at that very young age, there's a bifurcation that happens where some children are told, hey, you've kind of got this thing, you might be a child genius, and they get nudged to do things which tap on that talent, and otherwise they don't. What happens to the young people who are told that they have it? One thing that could happen is a sense of complacency. I think part of the glorification of genius and the fact that it is so all-encompassing and powerful leads people to think it is sufficient for success. Very often, many people who were told that they were child geniuses just don't work hard enough to tap on that genius until they reach a point where people have overtaken them, and the potential that genius had is lost. But second, and more likely statistically, is that child is not a genius, right? Like geniuses make up an exceedingly small part of the population curve. And so when these children grow older and realize that their achievements don't stack up to what other geniuses or their peers of the age look like, there's a crippling sense of failure, of the sense that they have lost something that was previously there, of unfulfilled promise. This is not the same with luck or hard work, because you can always say that I didn't succeed in those cases, not because I lost some innate talent that everyone said was super special, because I didn't work hard enough, and at least you can rectify that, or because it's something like luck, in which case you had no control over it. Does anyone have a POI for me? All right, cool. The second thing that happens is a degree of learned helplessness from a young age. Children, once they're boxed into being not a genius or lacking that genius, are less likely to try and aspire to, again, fields where genius is often seen as necessary to even get in the gateway in the first place, to climb the ranks of their academic or artistic achievement. The way in which this happens is partly that the child has a sense in which, by lacking that genius, which is typical of everyone at the top, because they lack it, it's something that, that their effort is going to be wasted in it, so they don't even try. But another way in which it happens very perniciously is that it cuts off any role models that could have previously appealed to them. Because what role models require in order to have that effect is something in common with you. But if there's something so different between a role model and what you have or where you are, the success of that role model is an irrelevant case study. So an example of this is someone like Judith Polgar, who is one of the best female chess players of all time. But the reason she doesn't get more attention in the discourse for how female chess players can also, match men at the very peak of the sport is because she's often just classified as a prodigy and a genius, as opposed to, I suspect, is as likely the product of an incredible amount of hard work. So lots of role model type stories become less relevant to children or to young people just because the overwhelming overhang of genius that tells the story of this person's achievement is something that is so inaccessible and so alien to everything that they've seen in their lives. It means that people who don't achieve feel worse about themselves, and people who could have achieved more and tried harder don't even try in the first place. And that is a worse world for us to live in.
Okay, we thank the speaker for this fine speech, and now invite the leader of the op.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, can you repeat?
Am I audible? Is it fine?
Yes, now better. Yes.
All right, great. I prefer just POIs in the chat if that's fine. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Gov's case seems extremely low impact. 1 point of mitigation before I go on. 1, given that geniuses are likely to be the minority of cases as opposed to the vast amounts of population, since your most super impacts only apply to geniuses, I'm not too sure why they're that important. Like, if so, some child geniuses are a little complacent. Most geniuses do enjoy lives that are beneficial. So I'm not too sure why some mental issues of occurring to geniuses is necessarily that bad, insofar as the glorification of geniuses allows them massive amounts of opportunities that I'm going to talk to you about. So geniuses, especially by their first argumentation, are usually well off. Like, there's, at one hand, they're saying Elon Musk is great, and the other hand, they're trying to make the argument that he suffers, so like that geniuses that like him will suffer from mental issues. But I don't understand this idea of the call out culture applying to geniuses, because geniuses can still be called out by, let's say, other geniuses, for example, who are on that same field or on that same stature. And I'm still not too sure why the call out culture is so significant status quo that it would have applied to people like Elon Musk in the first place. That meditation done, that's to understand which frame of the debate we're talking about. Understand we're talking about a frame where there's a largely capitalistic narrative in most societies, where the education system and generally the workforce is extremely competitive and kind of pushes you to compete, pushes you to work hard. Most religions and cultures over fetishize the idea of hard work being able to achieve most things. Notice in this frame, I don't think what you need is a narrative of role models and you should work harder and everything will be fine. Because the reality is, most of the times hard work does not lead to you achieving goals, i.e. there are racial or other sorts of issues, there are barriers, there are different potentials, there are issues of class and access and opportunities and discriminations that all mean you can't, that the very narrative that if you work hard enough, you would actually achieve the level of those people who are doing well isn't true in the first place. What are the impacts and what are the more process mechanism of this? The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is how mental health is worse off. Not just for the minute few geniuses who live a life that's pretty decent anyway, but for the vast majority of people. Because notice, in their world, what happens, these geniuses still exist, i.e. there are some people who have an innate ability, or some people just do well. So you still have that 1 or 4 or 5 kids in every school as if acing it, crushing the SATs, getting 1600, crushing the exams. You still have people in the field just absolutely nailing it. People in corporate workforces that are absolutely doing well, especially in the developing world context, people in your family, extended family, your cousins and so on, that people otherwise would have compared you to, that are just doing absolutely amazing. That is to say, since the capitalist structure usually forces you to compare yourself to them, I think it's more important to have the idea to label these people as geniuses, as in that you are less likely to compare yourself to them in the first place. I think OG concedes to this point at the point of which they say, oh, they don't act as efficient role models because you can't compare yourself to them in the first place. So I think they concede to this idea. Why are you less likely to compare to them in the first place? I'll take POIs after a little while, please. So there are a couple of things. Firstly, the the first premise of a genius bias defined by OGs themselves is that it is innate, i.e. you are unlikely to feel that you're doing something wrong at the point of which someone else is a genius just because they're innate to begin with. The second thing is that it's unattainable, i.e. no matter what I do, I can't achieve that level of genius, hence I shouldn't probably feel that bad. The last idea then is, since it's innate and unattainable, that you shouldn't pressurize yourself too much and force yourself to work really, really hard, especially because you probably already worked really hard in the comparative capitalist world anyways. You shouldn't bang your head and feel that there's something less with you at the point of which these are just people who are unattainable. And that's why, by measures of luck and talent and innate things, they're doing well. They're not just acing it because they're just working harder than you. At the point of which you believe the narrative that OG espouses, the filthy narrative that if you just simply work hard, you would have better grades and stuff of that sort, which is not directly distant of privilege, of innate talent and stuff of that sort. Lots of more kids are going to internally pressurize themselves, and lots of employees of the workplace are going to internally pressurize themselves to think, I should push myself further, I should work to the point of burnout because surely I can achieve those levels of people if I just work hard. That narrative is staged on our side of the house. But two other stakeholders that also ensure that your mental health is better, i.e. parents, especially brown parents, guys, in the vast developing world, they are less likely to compare you to other people. At the point of which my second speaker, Taha, just scored A stars every single time at his school, his parents largely stopped comparing their kids to him because they thought that he was a genius, that they classified him as one, and they held their kids to a different standard, i.e. a standard that is still not very great, but the standard that's still more cognizant of their own potential. Stuff like saying, leave him, it's fine, he's just naturally brilliant. What you should do is just work hard and try to get up your own potential. That means that there's less pressure on kids generally by parents to work hard. But the second thing I'm going to talk to you about is even from teachers and stuff of that sort, i.e. they're not going to be forcing kids or coercing kids generally, which they kind of have a bit of an incentive to do, to work harder and harder, because the narrative is changed. That i.e. hard work is not the thing that leads to the success of the few people you see at the top. There's a lot of other things that are beyond your control. So it's fine to take more leisure. It's fine to work a little less hard, especially because you're already working so hard at the point of which there are extreme amounts of burnout, there are extreme mental health issues. More on this, but yes, PY from from CG if they have one. Closing?
Yeah, so how exactly can you resolve that that like if you can never achieve intellectual greatness, then what does that motivate an individual to do?
I mean, you still have motivations. You still want to score well in your exams. You still want to get a decent job. You still want to do some sort of well in whatever you do, because there are capitalist and competitive pressures that all identify to you. I don't see why you need this additional pressure at the point of which it's enough to drive you over the edge, especially because students, because professionals all across the world are facing massive mental health crises. They're already being pushed by, let's say, the student board, by parents to work really, really hard for their SAT exams. I think this gets a lot less on our side of the house at the point of which parents are like, okay, do work hard for your SAT, but it's fine if you don't get the same amount of SAT score as your cousin Sharmila, for example, because Sharmila was just a genius at the first place. With that said, I think this is a huge impact, way outweighs anything that OG talked to you about. Because this impact affects not just geniuses, which are the minority, but literally everyone else who doesn't do so well in academics or in the workplace, which is the majority. I.e. in the capitalist world, most people will not make it. Most people will not get perfect scores. Most people won't get the CEO position. I.e. in that context, it's better them to not blame themselves and to say that they could have done something different, and because then the vast amounts of people feel a lot better, and you have less things like self-harm, suicide, or just generally mental health and depression issues in the first place. The second thing I'll talk to you about is how class and gender lines are all cut across with the idea of the genius. So for the few minority of geniuses, I think the concept that these people are geniuses allows them to access more opportunities, because in direct action to their point, that is to say, parents are likely to be convinced at the point at which their kid is dubbed by teachers and students all around in society at large to be a genius. They're likely to reject social norms like patriarchy and so on that prevent women from going outside the house and say, okay, sure, I will put my girl in higher education. I will allow her to pursue math and the thing she actually wants to, because the idea here is she's a genius and I should not stop her, because we actually have a chance to ensure that that person succeeds. More on that in DLO, but for all of those reasons, mental health is the biggest issue in this debate. Please vote OO.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
The claim I found most totally laughable in that last speech was the idea that the Asian parents will stop comparing you to the geniuses because they think that somehow you're different. That is just not the experience of, I think, the vast majority of people who have such a background. I'm going to look at two things in this speech. First, I will deal with what the counterfactual looks like, addressing in large part the opening opposition case. Second, I want to revisit the analysis Teck gave you, which received like basically zero response, was not confined solely to discussing the impact on geniuses, but covers three broad themes. The impact on inspiration more broadly and how that affects everyone. Second, the impact on geniuses and why that also matters. And thirdly, the impact on intellectual progress writ large. Okay, what is the counterfactual? I want to be very clear here. The assertion from opening up is, if you do not credit genius, you will instead glorify hard work. That is clearly a false dichotomy, and here is why. Insofar as societies are interested in creating metrics that glorify and approve of success, there are three components at least that contribute to success. There is talent, there is luck, and there is hard work. It is unclear to me why removing the first factor necessarily also removes the second factor. I'd like to point out why it is plausible that at least to some degree, our narrative will be a mix between recognizing and glorifying luck in addition to recognizing and glorifying hard work. The reason is because just by revealed preference, by revealed behavior, whenever people tend, like when people credit people for their achievements in particular fields, like in sports or in academia, often one of the first things those people say is, I was very lucky. I'm aware, and societies are continuously more conscious of the fact that luck and privilege play a massive role in determining what makes the outcome of the choices that you undertake. But to be very clear, the difference here is that talent occupies a strange area of our brain space, right? Where despite the fact that talent is also a kind of luck, we often think that because talent is something which you have and because it's special in a certain way, that means that that we don't need to critique the structures that give rise to talent in the same way we critique the structures that give rise to the distribution of opportunities via the birth lottery. So to be very clear, it is at least plausible that we will have luck recognized as one of the key factors that contributes to success. But okay, let us say for the sake of argument that hard work is the other big metric that gets evaluated. I want to respond directly to the claims we heard from opening up. So the claim we get from them is, now you won't compare yourself to geniuses, and that means that you're less likely to incur the mental health costs. Three key responses. One, even if you don't compare yourself to geniuses, others will compare you to geniuses, notably the capitalist structures they describe that reward hard work monetarily and also by social prestige are still going to reward those who sit at the top. So the difference is, on our side, you retain the hope within you that someday, should you aspire hard enough, you could rise to the top. Whereas on opposition side, you are rewarded for being at the top, but also told that if you aren't there already, you have no prospect whatsoever of making it. So the distinction is one of whether you retain any aspirational feeling within you or whether you feel entirely resigned. Second, and this was laughable, they said parents won't compare you to the geniuses. Firstly, I think most parents always want to believe their children are geniuses or have something special about them. That is just what it means to nurture a thing for 18 years. And that means that parents will expect you to be achieving as much as the other geniuses are, even if you aren't. But second, I think if your parents acknowledge that you are not a genius, they're never going to want to think it's their fault, right? They're going to want to think it's a fault of yours, that you are defective in some way, that despite the fact I gave you all the genetic material for you to become a genius, because you failed to become one, it must be something defective on your part. So parents are going to massively amp up that pressure in a world where geniuses are the alternative. Thirdly, this is very important. Working hard is a good thing, even if you never rise to the absolute top. Because even if you never become the best pianist in the world, you will still become the best pianist you could be. That matters for two reasons. One, you will still get more success as assigned by a capitalist system that the opening opposition describes than if you never tried. And two, because you feel that you achieved your peak potential. And that matters because that is the difference between feeling like you've achieved something with your own life, that you became the best version of yourself you could be, or feeling like your life was a waste up till that point. So I don't think this material stands. Note here, the rest of the opening opposition in terms of the rebuttal is not responsive. They say our impacts apply only to geniuses, that is false. They say that geniuses can be called out by others. But by their own concession, there are very few geniuses, which means I'm confused as to why you think that call-out culture will be significant in a world where geniuses are insulated from critique. Second, the claim Teck makes here is that geniuses are insulated from critique by the belief that the fact they are a genius excuses their bad behavior because they were just being eccentric, right? That is a stereotype of what genius is. You're an eccentric, high-functioning sociopath, in the words of the TV series Sherlock, which is maybe one of the greatest parties guilty of glorifying this sort of eccentric genius. So even if that call-out, not only is that call-out culture vastly reduced, but it's also rendered ineffective. Okay, what does Teck bring you broadly in his speech? I will take a POI from CEO if you have one.
Yeah, so literally there's no reason that like parents would only glorify you on the basis of genius or only hold you to the standard of genius. They want you to be successful so that they can brag about you, so that you can support them when you're older. This does not require genius in order for it to
yes, but you're right. Parents want you to be successful so they can brag about you. I'm glad you concede that. So they're going to say, my neighbor has a son who is a genius. Why are you not like him? Why do you not have that thing that he has? And that makes the child feel terrible because there is literally nothing they can do to achieve that thing if they believe that it's a born innate characteristic. Okay, inspiration. This matters, right? This is a massive impact because it's what drives people to become the best versions of themselves, and that matters to their quality of life. But it also produces like generally good outcomes for society when people are aspiring to do the best they can in their fields. Teck explains why you destroy role models, because role models like Judith Polgar are not seen as people whom you could be, but people you could never be, because they are fundamentally different to you. This discourages other people. It sets up expectations that are disappointed when the vast majority of children are told, you're a genius, and then find out they're not. And that does cause all the mental health problems that this opposition describes on a massive scale. Second text tells you about the impacts on geniuses themselves. I'd like to point out, like, opening up says this is a small impact. I'm not sure why we should prioritize the mental health of one person over any other. The problem with this argument is that the problem in this argument is that glorification of other qualities are not also themselves always healthy ones, right? Like the glorification of eccentricity or the glorification of mental health issues in the art community. But there's also a lot of pressure on geniuses who feel like they need to prove themselves, right? They need to, like, because they've been given this talent from birth, it is something which is going to go to waste if they don't act upon it. That creates lots of pressure on geniuses that leads to burn out early in their careers. That is harmful both to them and to societies that lose out on the insights they could have passed on. And finally, intellectual progress. This also matters because, like, even if you are a strict utilitarian, like, intellectual progress eventually filters down into the technologies we use and the quality of life that those technologies raise. The problem is believing I am not one of the geniuses means you believe you can't critique the work that geniuses have left behind. Yes, that critique can be made by other geniuses, but as opposition concedes, those are few and far between. That silos academia into respecting the works of the geniuses who have come before you and inhibits intellectual progress. Our impacts are not limited to geniuses, although I think their lives also matter. I'm very happy to stand in government.
Thank the speaker for this fine speech, and now invite the deputy leader of the op.
Hi, before I start, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible to me.
Okay. Let's start off with talking about access. And I think there are two reasons for why genius is just much more accessible than the converse. And I'm going to explain why hard work has got to be the counterfactual that these guys need to support. I think the first reason for access is particularly the one that they give you, which is genius is innate. Genius does not care about gender. Genius does not care about ethnicity, race, what religion you come from or what class you are from. I think this idea of hard work in comparison then is much less accessible for two reasons. Because one, because of just the fact that discrimination exists in the workplace, within universities, within educational institutions, within society broadly. The fact that you are doing hard work means that lots of this is immaterial because it's not credited. But secondly, you must work harder than other people with built-in privilege because of the race that they were born into or the religion that they were born to attain the same results that they do. So I think that's the first reason. I think the second reason is with regards to the lots of fields argument that we gave you. It's not that genius is limited to say just the sciences or just chess. It's limited to, it's basically unlimited to like lots of kinds of professions and fields. That is, you can be a genius at sports, different kinds of sports. If you want to go into science, there are different kinds of sciences and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure why this is something that is extremely limited and therefore is not attainable by the vast majority of society. I think that's the first thing I want to say. I think the second thing I want to point out is government must defend hard work on their end, and they can't use luck as a cop-out because of two structural reasons. Because one, luck is intangible. You can't measure luck, while hard work is quite clearly visible. So that's why you will always value hard work more than luck. I think the second thing that the second reason for why you always want to prioritize hard work is because it is controllable, i.e. the amount of work that you put into something is controllable as opposed to luck, which is not controllable at all. It is not something that is within your hands. That's why I think if you take away genius, people will largely focus on hard work because luck is just broadly beyond their control and not measurable at all. And that's where I think the vast majority of our material steps in. Now, what is our material? I think generally what we're talking about is kids' lives become much shittier under their side of the house. I think the first thing that we need to focus on is even if we disregard talent as the general category that we want to consider, even if we disregard the narrative that we should all be geniuses, talent still exists, right? Some people are still naturally disposed to doing maths better than other people and all of those sorts of things, which means that just naturally, even if we disregard all other kinds of privileges that people have, which also, by the way, make them better than, say, minority kids or women, etc., I think talent still exists. And insofar as that talent still exists, there are certain things that they will do in the classroom that other kids will not be able to do. There are certain things that they will be better at that other kids will not be better at. I think hard work is generally like, even the kids who are geniuses will want to work hard, because like, if genius doesn't work hard, it falls. Like they need to attain, they still have capitalist incentives like getting into university or getting a job and so on and so forth. Why is this then a problem? Because insofar as talent still exists, and insofar as this is something aspirational that parents look forward to or want their kid to become, it makes life much more difficult for kids who are not naturally disposed to that certain kind of subject area or certain kinds of education. And that's a problem then, because we remove the explanation that this is something that is an innate characteristic. Now imagine what that does to a kid. And this directly engages with the idea of motivation. I think this blows motivation to shit at the point at which you keep working hard, work harder than them perhaps in certain contexts where you're reading more than them and you're doing more than them, but you are not capable of achieving what they are capable of achieving. And I think without this explanation that it's okay, just let go, they have a natural advantage, I think these kids then blame themselves a lot more under our side of the house, as opposed to saying this is just uncontrollable and not something that is achievable. Now let's look at parents, right? What do parents do? I think the contention that they give you is Asian parents will always presume that you are defective and so on and so forth. I think the first major reason for why Asian parents will not say you are defective is because technically if they say that you are defective, they're also saying that they themselves are defective. Given that this is an innate thing, then it is broadly genetically controlled. Saying that you are defective also means that they're saying they are defective. I think that everybody just likes to think that they're not defective, which is why they won't probably say this. But again, pressure from parents exists in both worlds. What then happens to these kinds of kids is the question, right? At the point at which you recognize as an adult that there are certain kids with natural dispositions, you are not likely to push your kid so hard that you essentially break them to the point that they reach those kinds of grades. But in a scenario where it is seen as something that is achievable, then incentives exist for teachers, for parents themselves to push these kids as hard as possible. And I think they don't weigh up against like Ahsan's idea of burnout, right? Because burnout is a genuine thing that kids face. If you are working hard for your studies all the time, it means that there's less time for you to, for instance, enjoy entertainment, hang out with friends, do other sorts of things which are essential and key to happiness. And I think that that's a huge problem for them, right? Because kids are not always going to be happy because of hard work. They also need other kinds of connections and things for their life to be much better off. I think you cut them off at the point at which parents are incentivized to say, work hard, get the grade that kid is getting, and then become successful, because success is important in either world. The last thing I want to point out is we have, like, generally kids are much better off under our side of the house because the simple fact that they have more choices. That is to say that under their world, there are certain professions that are always going to be prioritized. Why? Because one, governments always have labor shortages, which is why they give incentives for people to get into certain professions, and those professions are more secure. But two, certain kinds of jobs are socially valuable, such as being a preacher or whatever the fuck society values, Pakistan values, for instance, doctors, etc. Because they're seen as prestigious jobs. And lastly, because parents want their kids to go into financially secure outcomes. I think the problem with this is oftentimes geniuses exist in fields where people will traditionally not go. So for instance, things like chess, they don't go over there, right? Or other sorts of things which are essentially much more risky than the converse. I think the problem then is kids are then forced to go into lots of professions because of financial security. Because on the other side, what we have on our side, I'm sorry, you're out of time. What we have on our side of the house is saying, this kid is innately good at chess. This kid will reach the epitome of chess. So I think in that way, we give much more choices to kids at the point at which they are seen as geniuses. The second thing I want to talk about is just generally just refuting this idea of we don't think about mental health issues when it comes to genius people. I think the first thing is at the point at which mental health issues occur to genius people, we actually protect them much more, because if society values them that much, we want them to do whatever they're doing and keep on doing it. So at that point, I think we do want to protect their mental health. But secondly, I think discourse is much better on our side of the house. When you can say a genius like Kurt Cobain fucking killed himself, and this is a real world issue, it makes it much more real for a lot of people who have been following these geniuses, who value their work and so on and so forth. So I think that's another thing. And the last thing that Ahsan pointed out, which we don't get rebutted to, is the fact that when you are a genius, you are given much more opportunities than other people. for people from like, say, minority classes or races, these are key kinds of opportunities for all these reasons. Very proud to post.
Okay, we thank speaker for that fine speech, and now we invite the member of the government to extend the case for side government.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay, great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening government wanted to talk about how this is bad, mainly for geniuses, but failed to explain what the counterfactual looks like for broader society and how average individuals interpret this narrative and how it affects our perception of children and other people and how we distribute resources given this narrative. I think the counterfactual that we're going to bring you in CG is that our world is one where we're less focused on the top 1% of intelligent people. We're less focused on giving them all the opportunities and maximizing genius in society. Our world is one where we're more likely to democratize intelligence, tell more people that they're valuable, even if they're not the smartest person in their class, even if they're not like getting straight A's or they're like playing violin at grade 8 at like 5 years old. We're going to democratize intelligence and redistribute our resources in a way that's more equitable and gives more people opportunities to succeed. First, 3 things in closing government. First, just how this narrative is internalized and why the external imposition of this is more important, largely dealing with OO stuff. Second, how this affects the education system. And third, why our counterfactual is better. So first, how does this narrative materialize? I think opening government largely talked about the effects of geniuses, and I think they're probably correct. But what we posit to you is the external imposition of this narrative is far more important than how individuals themselves interpret this narrative or how they internalize it. And I think this is going to deal with a lot of the opening up claims, because if we prove to you that individuals who themselves are like told that they are geniuses don't believe this as much as other people in society do, then a lot of their harms fall out of the debate. Few reasons why this is true. One, I think people who are geniuses largely do things like self-criticize or want to improve in order to get to the states that they are. So in order for you to be like grade 8 violin, you have to be very critical of your mistakes. And in order to be like a Nobel scientist, you have to be a Nobel chemistry winning scientist or whatever. You have to be very critical of your research and point out all the different mistakes. So they're largely critical. They're unlikely to believe that they're perfect or infallible in the ways that other people see them. I think secondly, just even if this is true, they're more likely to want to see their product as a product of work. So their hard work is what led to this, not some innate characteristic that they were magically bestowed with. I think the third thing is that genius is often based on what other people perceive to be valuable. So things like art, for example, with Van Gogh is based on whether other people buy into what you think is good art. And like music, for example, is based on whether other people think your performance was good. I think this means that oftentimes, if you are an individual, it's very hard for you to assess whether you yourself are genius. Genius is often something that manifests from a large number of people telling you and affirming that you have done something good. So oftentimes this means that a lot of the problems that OO talks about people like interpreting this and like being like hard on themselves or whatever, isn't really comparative. And I think the external imposition of this narrative is far more important, because what this debate is truly about is how other people treat geniuses versus how they treat non-geniuses, and why a world without like the treatment of geniuses, or a world where we don't really care about geniuses or cultivate genius as much, is a world that is preferable. I think we're going to get far better and more equitable resource distribution when we don't care about cultivating the 1% and we care more about people who may be like somewhat intelligent or like less intelligent, but have like some potential in succeeding, as opposed to just like the maximum potential. So second, how does this affect education? I think, so I think like I think largely a society that prioritizes genius is one that is also going to spend the resources to cultivate it and maximize it whenever they spot it. Because I think what OG points out that's important is that oftentimes like people who are children or very young have like the inklings of genius, and people can pick up on these things, but they're not at like a genius level yet. So you to be called a genius still requires you to have like some magnificent artwork or some accomplishment that people can point to. Like nobody is born a Nobel like chemistry winning scientist. You have to develop that. So people oftentimes want to take credit for this cultivation when it's young. So this is why education matters the most, because this is when people can point it out. So there are a few reasons why this is true. One, people just want to take credit for it. So finding children with genius traits and identifying that is something that is like admirable. Like if you're a teacher and you have like a genius kid, you can take pride in that yourself, and other people are going to call you a good teacher. But secondly, like there are incentives for doing this because you glorify genius, and like geniuses are celebrated when they're associated with a particular institution or body, i.e. if they're associated with a high school, or if they're associated with like a particular country, then that organization or that body also gets praise. Like high school funding is largely determined by the number of students you have scoring at a very high level, and to some extent also like the top like 1% of students, or like the best student in that field. So I think what this means is you focus a lot of your efforts on trying to identify people with genius traits and trying to identify people who have these sort of things, which means that you do a couple of things that are pretty harmful for everyone else in society. So one, you do things like setting up private schools or like boarding schools for like very, very talented individuals to like, and special schools for gifted kids exclusively. You focus your best resources there. You focus like your best teachers there. I think secondly, the classroom dynamics as well for individual teachers are affected. So like you spend a lot more time as a teacher focusing your efforts on one kid when there are 20 other kids in that class that you could be teaching and working on better. Like you try and focus on getting them from like an A to an A+ or a 99 to 100, as opposed to getting the kid from a 60, the kid with a 60 to a 70. This is the same with states. They focus on the top 1% and they glorify these people, as opposed to helping people who may be like average, who have done like reasonably like important things. I think also it's like when you're older, like the link to getting like shielding people from criticism is also that we give geniuses a lot of resources. So we don't just like give them leeway because they're smart. We also give them a lot of resources. We give them money, we give them funding, we give them all of these things. So it's very hard for us to criticize these people because we are complicit in what they've done because we fund it and we support it. That's the link that OG missed. So I think what is the counterfactual then, and why is this preferable? I think largely when you are less likely to focus all your resources on a few individuals, you're less likely to leave people behind, and you're more likely to be inclusive in crediting people for their intelligence and the things that they have done. So I think largely a lot of people aren't intelligent or don't have genius traits because a lot of problems with education and becoming intelligent are structural. So like poverty, for example, makes it hard for you to go to school. Like the household that you grow up in makes it hard for you to study or like do well in school. Like the funding that your school get is like arbitrary, and that's not something that you consented into. So it's very hard for a lot of people to succeed if they don't have equal resources. I think a world where you democratize education, you don't care about genius as much, is a world where you're less likely to focus on the top 1% and spend those resources more equitably. So you have more school funding, for example, you have better teachers in more schools, and more kids have access to this. More kids like get the attention they deserve. And I think with parents as well, parents are less likely to focus all their efforts on like their eldest kid who's successful and focus it more on like both of the kids. And this is good because one, more people are going to feel valued in society and validated for their intelligence and what they've accomplished. But two, you get more like generally intelligent people overall, as opposed to a few people who may be geniuses. Proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I invite the member of the op to extend his debate from the side of opposition.
Everybody can hear me? I'm glad that CG extended this debate into the realm of resource allocation, because we're going to be operating in the same vein. I think that any analysis that you hear about mental health in this debate is always going to be secondary to questions of like, can we get better doctors? Can we get better researchers? Can we alleviate poverty through technocratic gaps being filled? Can we have people return to work because technocratic gaps are being filled in policy by effective policymakers who know how to do this work at a faster pace and have a greater capacity to succeed? But not only that, because we're also going to talk about the equitability of this resource allocation and why it leads to more social mobility in a way that I think was surprising that OO left out. So first first some refutation, then our argument on resource allocation, and some comparative analysis if I have time for it, but it'll probably be integrated. But I am just going to focus most of this refutation on OG because CG will be quite implicit. So we get this idea that you can't critique these people because they have cult of personality and because they're quirky and because they're geniuses. I think that this betrays the actual reason why you can't critique these people, which is the cult of personalities, because they're famous, they're successful. People who aren't geniuses, but are like the Kardashians, but are also famous and successful, also are difficult to critique, right? Like, it's not clear why this is the tipping point. CG says, well, you can't critique them because they're funded. Presumably someone who didn't fund them can critique them, right? Like, that's not a particularly compelling piece of analysis. So they also tell us about mental health. And first of all, I just think that this clash on front half is kind of weird about like hard work is always bad. It's bad to pressure people to work hard. Yes, it's bad to pressure people past their limit of working hard. It is not bad to allocate resources in an effective way that allows people to succeed, as we're going to talk about. They say that luck is the comparative. The actual reason why luck is not the comparative, unlike because it's untangible or uncontrollable that we got from OO, is because people want to justify their success, right? So it's incredibly unhelpful for you as a billionaire who says, under capitalism, I should be able to hold on to my wealth. If you also, by the way, use the narrative of hard work, because it's very hard to prove that you work for all that money. But I think it is very hard to say that, you know, I just got this money and therefore I should keep it, right? The reason is that you justify it using the idea of like, of genius, because you say that I'm such a genius, and I think that the comparative is probably going to be like that they're forced to justify it by hard work. They say parents want to think you're a genius and they'll blame you when you don't succeed. I think that many parents do this anyways because they value the success, as I mentioned. They want to see you support them and be someone they could brag about. You don't need to be a genius for that to be true. But also in terms of blaming you, like, I think that if we can allow more people to actually achieve this potential, this isn't particularly relevant. Some parents will treat their kids somewhat poorly in both worlds. Again, not clear why this is the big tipping point. They say if you're not a genius, you can't look up to role models. Presumably not all successful people are geniuses, right? So you probably could look up to someone who, like, I don't know, worked hard or was a good person or is good at what they do without assuming that they were like a genius and that's how they got them there. Okay, yeah, we are going to go into resource allocation. So basically, I think that this argument is premised on pretty much a lot of the analysis that CG also said, so I'm going to try to skim through it. Why we want to have people reach their potential. This looks like having like talent agents who seek out for college admissions or athletic scouts. They often go to places that otherwise wouldn't be visited, like the developing world, in order to seek out people with high amounts of potential. You often have things that test people's intrinsic skill. Like, even if standardized tests are pretty flawed, I think often like your just grades in schools are a worse representation of that because they tend to not represent your actual skill. But even just things like interviews are more likely to happen in the college process or the job admissions process in order to get a real like gauge on how smart you are, as opposed to, or how good you are at what you do, as opposed to just like whether you worked really hard in school because you were rich and you didn't have to work another job, so you're able to get a really good grade, or like you had a bunch of tutors. But I think that also college admissions allow you to do things like explain what got in the way of your success. That probably wouldn't exist in a world where we didn't say that your potential was what mattered. I also think that teachers investing in you is important, not just the most successful or notably the most wealthy kids, right? Because CG likes to run this comparative of like, or runs an uncomparative argument by saying that private schools are going to be set up, you're going to focus on the most gifted kids and not focus on anyone in public schools. But I think that the comparative is worse, right? It is focusing on the most privileged kids, the kids who you think, or the most successful kids, because the privileged kids have the highest predictor of success absent genius, right? This is really crucial because genius is, if nothing else, a competing factor that might determine that you can access success. And that is something that might lead to investment in people who otherwise don't get invested in. Like, teachers are probably not going to be investing in the most struggling kids in their world either, because those kids often pose a lot of barriers, require extra effort. That's probably another problem that doesn't get dealt with under this motion. There are a number of impacts from this. One, people are able to rise up and succeed regardless of their background, right? So they put money back into their communities. You have people who happen to be Black, who are academics, who can speak to their lived experience into mainstream consciousness because their intelligence was warranted and they were able for example, to get into Harvard despite not being someone who came from the most privileged community, because their potential was scouted and someone went to their low income community to look for that success because they saw that potential and thought it could be achieved. Also, you're more likely to train people on the job, right? You're more likely to invest in people who work in a job because you think that they could become incredibly successful if you gave them the chance. I'll take OG before I move on.
This is an argument for acknowledging the existence of genius, not an argument for glorifying genius.
So I don't think that you're likely to step past all these other predictors of success, like things like privilege or race or how much wealth you have, if because those are very good predictors of success, if you don't really glorify this other predictor of success and say that these people are going to be even more competent, right? Next, on resource allocation, I think that we want to see people who are better at what they're doing. We want to see people who are better at being a doctor, who can treat people better, who are more intelligent in terms of policy making, right? These people are going to have a greater threshold that they can reach. And if we recognize that and glorify that, we're more likely to see them reach that threshold. This also means that you do efficient resource allocation, i.e. as a company, you are investing in the people who are most likely to succeed, not putting a lot of effort into someone who succeeded because they had privilege or hard work, because you're looking instead at their potential instead of just what they have achieved. This means that you have more money, and in terms of the government, who also does this in a similar way, to put into things that are more productive, to put into other programs to maybe even help the people who can't succeed because they don't have mass amounts of talent to still live a decent life through programs like welfare. But I think that this needs to be weighed pretty highly in this round, right? Because this isn't just about, firstly, this is about equity. If we value social mobility and people's ability to achieve regardless of where they come from, I think that this is highly impactful. But this will weigh more than mental health, because if we can prove that resources are allocated better, talent is sucked out better, people are able to reach their potential in ways that make everyone's lives better through better doctors, better policymakers, that impacts everyone way more than mental health. We're proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now invite the government whip to end this debate for said government.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm awfully glad that closing opposition wanted to try to engage with us on this idea of resource allocation, but I don't think they actually address any of the links that Amaary gives. Because if you look at any of the incentives, there are assertions down the entire closing opposition case that employers, schools, that everybody is going to be pursuing intellectual growth and curiosity and trying to improve and trying to acquire talent. But it seems very intuitive to me that the case that Amaary brought you is that those institutions, like employers, like schools, try to focus on those top 1%, the people that they identify as geniuses, and society makes major investments in the top percentage of students, top percentage of people, in the cultivation of genius, the attempt to try to get people to be catapulted to the top where they are the biggest contributors to society, and it's almost fetishized, like the idea that some people are born with this innate ability that ought to be enabled, ought to be invested in, and everyone else has less capability, that their growth is capped. Right? And this is kind of something that even OO alludes to, because they say like, yeah, they're going to accept it. Like they know that at some point their intellectual capacity is capped and they can't achieve genius status, which is a silly argument, but I'll get to that later. There's a couple things in CO that I think are incredibly wrong. They talk about how they're going to have more doctors and educators on their side. Like, if anything, this shows how people don't need to be geniuses to have a major intellectual impact. This is an argument for enabling, like having a bottom-up approach to education, giving the tools to success, and democratizing them, as opposed to concentrating them at the top. I think genius is supposed to be like incredibly rare. That's what was given to us by opening government, right? But millions of people are smart professionals, lawyers, doctors, and they have major impacts. And you can't really say, like, CO can't just be like, yes, but they're all geniuses. Like, this is a very weird manipulation of the actual narrative as it manifests. So I think instead, if we're going to want more doctors, more educators, like even K through 12 teachers that are incredibly important, right? Like, not everybody thinks of those people as geniuses per se, but they are incredibly important to our society. And if we enable more people with the tools to be able to be part of those professionals to make an impact on society, I think that is going to result in better outcomes. Then they say that parents will have similar expectations, and it's not clear how that they're going to change. Look, here's a unique extension that's coming out of CG in regards to parenting, which I think is more important than what OG brought you on parenting. It's about the misallocation of resources. It's that when a parent identifies that a child has this like X factor, right? That they're the genius child and the other one is like the not so smart child, like they're the less bright child. They allocate resources in the home towards that child, like tutoring resources. And the reason for that is because there's a trade-off, right? I mean, households are limited in what resources they could give, and they see like diminishing returns if they give it to the kid who's not going to learn as well, not going to be able to handle those resources effectively. Whereas they see a genius kid where they keep throwing stuff at him, like tutoring services, all of these books, him or her, and like this is going to result in like actual actions taken by the parents, not just words that were talked about in the opening half, right? But actual actions by parents that result in children feeling unloved, comparatively worth less than other siblings, but also functionally means that one child is being enabled, like the smarter one is being enabled, whereas the other child gets left behind. And we think that is awful for different children to get left behind. And obviously parents want their kids to succeed, but their trade-off exists in where they're going to allocate those resources. Then they say that they're going to have like more testing and gauges of success on their side, and that college essays are a result of the genius narrative. Unclear that's true. I think it's more likely on our side because we focus on bottom-up investments. Like everybody on their side of the house, it means that colleges are more likely to pick kids that are the top 99 percentile of testing scores, right? We think that's a very toxic way to do that, and then that's trying to identify geniuses, because you don't go like, oh, maybe I'll read their essay and see if they're a genius when they got like a 1280 on SAT. I don't think that's how that manifests. And there are two main takeaways on CO here. First, if CO is arguing that aspiration of genius is good and more likely on their side, then they have major tension with OO, where OO is like, we'd rather kids resign themselves if they're not going to become geniuses, so that they're not going to try to aspire to become that level. Because it seems like CO is saying they want, like, every kid is going to try to become that genius and try to become more intellectually stimulated or pursue that. Secondly, it seems to me that this is a very toxic way of pursuing intellectual growth. If the game is too unfair and the expectations are too high, i.e. the focus is on becoming the top 1% in society. This is similar to OO's analysis, which is weird that I'm using this against CO, right? But people are more likely to give up when the game is stacked against them and when they feel the expectations are unfair. We think that intellectual curiosity, in democratizing that and having realistic comparisons to yourself, are far more reasonable ways of getting people motivated and keeping them motivated to continue learning. I'll take a POI from OO if they have.
Yeah, so why won't society allocate greater resources to people that get better grades just because they work harder instead of using the narrative of geniuses?
I think generally, because it's a glorification of geniuses, right? And it's the idea of if you have genius, then you will be able to use those resources far more effectively. And then if you don't, that it's not going to be worth nearly as much. If anything, it's a catalyst, like it's getting worse. And I say that like it's a comparative, right? Maybe it's not all, but we say we get far better allocation of resources on our side of the house. Now let's talk about OO. I think they talk about generally kids being happier when they no longer have to compare themselves to geniuses. Apart from how depressing this argument is on face, that kids are going to resign themselves to be like, oh, I'll never be Elon Musk. I'll never be like, I don't know how that's good for their happiness. Secondly, I think kids are never really sure whether they are geniuses or not. Like people like are incentivized, as Amar said, to tell children that they're geniuses when they show any signs of it. And it sets up the expectation that they end up failing. So like, OO's case ends up actually acting upon itself. Thirdly, I think the counterfactual is far better because, as we said, like, and that's something that OG didn't bring you, which was the realistic counterfactual. The focus is no longer on the top 1% of intellect. That destroys and basically neuters the entirety of the OO case, because I think that focus on top 1% of intellect is going to be far less on our side. Remember, it's just comparatively far less. And if we can diminish that, then I think that's better. Here's a way. First, I think is that even if some children set lower expectations for themselves and are happier about that on their side, this only comes after giving up on yourself and also is followed by demeaning and unfair misallocations in society that reflect you having less worth as a human being of an innate trait that you quote unquote cannot control or cannot improve upon. This is far worse. Secondly, even if some children are happier with their intelligence on their side, they access less tools for success that determines their broader happiness. Because remember, succeeding is like a major part of your success, whether or not you're a genius, kind of a minute point in society. Like, I don't think we all, like outside of this round, really think like, am I a genius? Am I not? And it determines like your happiness on an everyday basis. I think this is kind of debatey language that I don't think OG should even win off of, because I think it's far more important about how this is actually internalized. It's in the education system. It's how we allocate resources towards talent in the home and in school. And for those reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now would like to invite the op-whip to end this debate.
Am I audible?
Can you speak a bit more loud, a bit louder?
Right now, is that better?
Yeah, that's better if you move your mic a bit.
All right, so a few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to deal with OG and kind of the weird impacts that they want to sell you that are not that big as they claim. And then I'm going to deal with the whole clash in opening half about hard work versus talent, which I also don't think is a big issue. And then we're going to deal with the clash that we mostly had with our closing theme, and that is the resource allocation and why we think it is way better off, in a sense that you're going to get more achievement for society as general, right? You're going to have more better invention. You're going to have more people reaching their potential in a sense that they wouldn't otherwise, right? I think that it's really not mechanized in what we get from CG, how they're going to have this best resource allocation. It seems like they're going to pretty much give everyone the same thing because it's so bad to give to geniuses. We're going to tell you why you really need to invest in those smarter individuals and let them get farther. Let's start with a little bit of responses, but I'm going to touch more on that later. Firstly, again, about a comparative, I think it's quite strange to say that all of a sudden teachers and parents are going to put so much resources in this weak child, because they say, let's say you have a smart kid and you have one that isn't as smart, you're still going to put more into the smart kid because it's easier, right? It has nothing to do with glorification. It's that CSG refuses to acknowledge the fact that it's hard to help the weakest child. And when you're talking about like average children, I'm not sure that the difference is that big. Like what big of a difference it is for society and for the child if it gets a 60 in test or a 70, right? The big impact that they create there is unclear. And if you really have such a weak child, I think in both worlds, it's very difficult for you to have that much resources to help them. You have many reasons not to do that when you think they really don't solve the problem. More than that, we think when they say you only invest in the 1% is taking our case to the most extreme, which is not how we analyze that. It was very clear in this round that you can be genius in most fields, and it's not just one thing. You cannot. It's not like you're intellectual in math and that is all. We think that when we scout people, when we have intelligence tests, we can also see which child is excellent with music or sports and so many different fields, meaning that even if you're the 1% in math, you have so many children that can be excellent in different fields. So we are talking about a big group. And also when they give this assumption, well, millions of people are doctors and lawyers, and that's fine. We say that in a lot of cases, that is because we from a young age gave them enough resources so they can go to medical school and actually achieve there. So it actually works better with our case, which is the world right now, when they're actually arguing a different world where you probably wouldn't have put enough resources for the child to become a successful doctor. But more than that, we are talking about the most extraordinary doctors that wouldn't have existed if we hadn't given them enough resources, because maybe that doctor is a black doctor from a poor town and he only had the ability to reach that far and to have this incredible cure develop because we put more resources into them. So not 1%, and also we have the bigger impact. So let's deal with OG for a second, because OG tells you mainly two things. One of them is the impact about criticizing geniuses. Firstly, I think the CG kind of rebuts it well when they say that geniuses can be self-critical, which makes me wonder from the very beginning of this round, how big of a problem is it, right? How big of a problem is geniuses doing such bad behavior? If I'm convinced by CG that they can be self-critical, they probably won't win awards and get a huge following if they're that bad. So not that big of a problem, even if OG manages to solve that. But more than that, Micaela tells you that probably has nothing to do with this round because you don't criticize them because they're famous. And if you still claim they're so unique, you won't criticize them just because they're genius, well, other famous people are going to do this terrible behavior, so criticize them. You still have this kind of criticizing bad behavior in society. Honestly, I'm not sure how this impact can win. The second thing they talk about is this children. You're screwing over children by marking them as geniuses when they're not. So firstly, we think it's pretty rare when you have a child that can speak many languages or really have those early signs of genius and really is not smart. Maybe they're not a genius, but the fact that you see that from a young age means that you can actually identify them. So in really rare cases, they're going to be so stupid that it's a waste of time to try to push them forward. But we say in a lot of cases that is a good thing that you do there. More than that, this goes to our case because we think in a lot of senses, and parents wouldn't push a child to the fact that to the case where the child is going to break. In a lot of cases, they will push them into extracurricular activities. They will give them the piano lessons that they would have given otherwise. So maybe you're going to put more pressure, but in a lot of ways, this pressure is going to promote them. And I think the analysis of that making it negative is assuming that you're always going to push them too far. And when we bring in the sense that parents want their child to be successful, and it's a failure for you as a parent, if your child failed, you're more likely to see their small achievement, even if they're genius and they could have achieved more, you see them as success. You want your child to be happy more than you want them to be that big of a genius. So even if they don't achieve that much, we think the parents are not going to push them to the extent that they break. And if they will, it probably has nothing to do with the narrative. They're just bad parents. Let's talk about the counterfactual that we see in opening half and why we don't think this is what matters in this round. So that is the counterfactual with hard work and talent. I think OG themselves talk about hard work and something existing. What does that mean? It means that currently you talk about a pianist that worked really hard in order to compose that many new creations. Your scientist works for years in order to achieve this amazing invention. So both narrative exist in a status quo. What does that mean? It means that maybe the balance kind of changes a little bit more for hard work, but still it's unclear why this change is that much of a big deal and why we need to focus that much of the debate, specifically considering, yes, we agree with OO, you're probably not going to identify with them as role models. And Micaela tell you have so many different role models. And if you don't feel comfortable with thinking about genius as the thing you need to aspire to, you have other role models to aspire to. So I don't think like hard work or talent is the big thing in this round. And I think already the difference is small and it's unexplained why it's that big of a deal. And also the impact that we give you and people actually achieving that much more just because of this narrative is enough for us to win. Before I move on, opening.
Historically, most geniuses come from privilege because they had the resources to realize their genius. That means when you're scouting for genius, you'll scout in those statistically overrepresented communities, not the communities your side is interested in.
Okay, so look what OG just told us. Well, your scouting isn't perfect, but what's the comparative, right? Because obviously, maybe scouting can be led by privilege, but what we tell you, and this is our last clash, without the glorification of genius, all you care about is privilege, because this is the thing that you see. This is the thing that is clear for you and easy. We say specifically when you glorify genius, that means it pushes you to look for geniuses in other realms, right? It pushes you to look outside of the privilege, which you would have seen otherwise, because as OG said, it's easier for you to succeed if you're privileged. We say already here, even if geniuses are rare, the impact is huge, and the scouting that you do are positive. And even if CG tells you why private schools are bad, well, they're not mutually exclusive with putting public funds into improving schools in general, right? But we say specifically, only under the mechanism of glorification, you will be able to see people with potential. You seek them actively. You'll give them the resources to improve. And there, specifically there and only there, you have people reaching potential in their life. You have people having tremendous inventions. Only when you push them, only when you push and go to those poor towns, because you aren't relying on privilege, but on genius, something that is really random, only then you will be able to get to those achievements, and we are very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank the speaker for this fine speech. Thank all of you. And now you should probably leave this room and leave us to adjudicate. Thank you all once more.